I'm Rob.
And I'm Ardi. And welcome to Tradesplaining, a podcast that tries to make sense of international trade, business, and expat life without putting you to sleep.
In episode 65, we'll talk about the U.S. borrowing its way to economic growth. It's a grand tradition. AI and trade, obviously. And you guessed it, China. And later we'll be joined by New York Times global economic correspondent Peter S. Goodman on his second trip to Tradesplaining, who will talk to us about his latest book, How the World Ran Out of Everything Inside the Global Supply Chain. And of course, why Ardi shouldn't worry so much. And we'll throw in a few points on listener feedback, sneak in a news roundup. Oh yeah, and a few jokes.
Well, everyone, welcome to episode number 65.
Blah.
It is a big number. Specifically, it is the atomic number of the chemical element terbium, a silvery white rare earth metal that is malleable and ductile, like most people over 65.
It's worse than tertium.
It's the ninth member of the lanthanide series.
Oh no, we love them lanthanides.
They're back. Terbium was discovered by Swedish chemist Carl Gustaf Mosander, who discovered it as a chemical element in 1843, which was probably shortly after Rob learned how to ride a bike.
Carl was a pretty cool guy.
Yeah.
I enjoyed him.
In keeping with this theme, in many countries, 65 is also considered the traditional age for retirement, although that is gradually increasing in some places, unless, of course, we're talking about the UN, in which case it's
62.
Reverse. It's also known as the Jubilee. So the 65th anniversary is referred to as the Blue Sapphire anniversary. It's also a card you get from Chase, I think.
That's gin. Isn't that a gin?
Both. What I think is most important to mention is the fact that Justin Timberlake is bringing sexy back to jail. I don't know if you saw, but he was recently arrested in the Hamptons. So
is he 65?
But he's taking over Billy Joel's job, who's probably retired from getting pulled over in the Hamptons drunk.
I don't know why they pull people over.
Well, he was swerving and ran a stop sign. So
okay, just give him a ride home. Let's not do this.
Apparently, the cop who pulled Timberlake over was so young that he didn't know who the 10-time Grammy winner was. So that's how old I'm getting.
Doesn't even watch SNL.
I mean, JT is like at least 10 years older than me, but still, I mean, not that old. Anyway, he didn't recognize him or his name. And a second source says that Justin said under his breath, I don't know, he must be somebody who knows Justin Timberlake, "This is going to ruin the tour." The cop replied, "What tour?"
Good one.
And Justin said, "The world tour." But anyway, that's neither here nor there. So, Justin, we wish you well. We're glad that nobody got hurt. And next time, just take tips from Billy Joel on how to evade the cops better when you're on Long Island. More importantly, as always, don't forget to subscribe to the podcast if you haven't done so
Maybe
already.
he wasn't in a New York state of mind.
Make sure you catch our future episodes coming out very soon. And better yet, you can also share it with a friend or a stranger. You can find us anywhere you get your podcasts. Subscribe to all of them and do leave us a review. I should mention, one place you can't find us anymore is Google Podcasts because they shut that down recently.
Yeah.
The better news is that it is now on YouTube. So listen to us there. Give us a like, a follow, subscribe, do all that fun stuff. And with that, Rob, what have you been up to? Since it's been a while since we last recorded, I should mention that it's your fault, as usual.
Yeah. I mean, I was out there trying to save the world. I was also eating tons of Mexican food in Chicago. But I think what's important is, and this is related to Mexican food, that we've now passed that line where more Americans say they use marijuana regularly than use alcohol. So we have 17 million people, which sounds low to me, who reported daily or near daily. I don't know what near daily could be.
Almost every day. And
only 14.7 million who used alcohol at the same frequency. Now, I feel like we're not making an effort out there. There's 300 million of us.
I think it's a case of our Billy Joel listeners, the boomers and Gen X are dying off.
Yeah.
And so Gen Z and maybe a little bit of millennials are picking up the slack in terms of doing that CBD oil.
I feel like, first of all, CBD oil is not really for young people. That's where you put it on your shoulder and then you feel like it's a miracle cure. But also, I feel like there's going to be also movements in other markets like Doritos, like cotton candy, at night egg making. Everybody needs an omelet at 4 a.m.
That's what we call it now?
That's exactly what we call it.
I feel like there'll be a China angle at some point. Yes, but how does China benefit?
These snacks are coming from China. What is the snack doing here?
Moving on. So then, jumping right into the important news stories this episode, we've got quite a lot, so we're going to run through them as quickly as possible so we don't have to pretend like we know what we're talking about.
Fantastic.
First one, IKEA seems to be recognizing this new volatile environment and has decided to move production to North America while the G7 mounts a united front on Chinese trade. Whatever
Yay.
that is. Yay. Mouse. So as I said, IKEA is looking to increase production in the US and in the Americas to address these ongoing shipping disruptions, which we've talked about on the podcast quite a bit, as well as the shift away from a more seamless global trade. Global supply chain managers at IKEA highlighted that North America in particular has limited regional production and prompted efforts to expand that footprint. Currently, only 10% of the goods IKEA sells in the Americas are produced locally, but the company sees significant opportunities for growth in the US, South, and Central America. So basically all of the Americas is what I should have said. This also aligns with this broader trend, which we've been seeing among international businesses, which are reconsidering their reliance on Asian factories due to these recent disruptions and geopolitical tensions, whether that's Houthi militants in the Red Sea, affecting supply chains, and so on. IKEA also says that disruptions are expected to continue, and this adds to their thinking. And as I said, this seems to be part of a general trend as many companies are doing so. European companies are also increasingly diversifying away from Chinese imports amidst this heightened scrutiny from Brussels, in particular concerning subsidies and potential tariffs on electric vehicles.
I think there's two things in there. One is IKEA and other European companies are actually, we said 2 years ago, it's not actually happening. There's not actually changes in the flow of trade. Companies are not doing anything different. Now they are. They're actually investing differently. They're moving stuff out of certain areas. They're repositioning production. So in this case, IKEA in North America, but there's also a lot of evidence that other European companies are doing the same thing. So it's whatever you call it, China plus one, it's diversification, it's supply chain resilience, but it is actually having an effect on how companies work. The second thing is the G7 now has this incredible unified view on Chinese production and Chinese trade. So they're actually coming together and they're sending out a message, which is we, G7, express our concerns about China's persistent industrial targeting and comprehensive non-market policy. So this is a very big, important statement to make across all these big economies where 10 years ago, 8 years ago, 5 years ago, this kind of thing would not have been unified. Europe and the US were not on the same page.
I think it's also important to point out that despite all this going on, China is still super competitive in terms of production costs and the complexity of sourcing lots of different products. So that's not going to change. So analysts, I should also have mentioned that they are suggesting that this will reconfigure the supply chain rather than completely sever it with China. So it'll just look different. I think it was Simon Evnett a couple episodes back who said this should be seen as better risk management rather than decoupling, things like this. So that's another way to look at it.
But when the Europeans are imposing an average tariff of 21% on Chinese electric vehicles, up to 38% for some companies, that's a significant change for them. And we reported maybe a year and a half ago how the Germans were panicking at this Munich auto show, like, geez, these cars are really good. It's literally a reaction to how good their cars are. Okay, yes, they've been subsidized. Yes, there's state support, blah, blah, blah. And yes, China has a plan. They want to dump tech products on everybody.
So one could say that Trump was ahead of the curve.
Thanks, Trump.
Speaking of winning, moving on.
Yes.
America seems to be doing a lot of it, especially after borrowing around $3 trillion in the last couple of years. So Europe, in comparison, seems to be falling behind by the U.S. in many respects, and many ways of measuring that. For example, in economic growth and the size of its economy and things like this. European leaders are aware of these challenges. They propose solutions, but the central issue is that Europe is not actually one country, but rather a collection of states. Despite many things like increased defense spending, their military capabilities still remain underwhelming, but there may be some sparks of hope in the future. Tell us a little about that, Rob.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think it's an interesting stock taking by the Washington Post. They were talking about the relative size of the European and the U.S. economies and which direction they're going. So they're saying the U.S. is constantly complaining about how things are going. And I know you've got a thought on that. Why are we complaining? Why does it feel like that? But if you look at the numbers, the U.S. is from being more or less the size of the EU economy, according to the story, in 2018, 2019, it's now double the size. So yes, there were $3 trillion of borrowing, blah, blah, blah.
Let's not talk about it. It's not important.
But in fact, you do see that. You see the one market of the United States, you want to put it that way, spawning bigger tech firms. You see innovation, you see investment moving that direction. So European savings is very high, but investment is moving to the U.S. And you see Europe recognizing it, but not necessarily being able to address it because of the fragmentation. Yes, there's Europe, there's an EU27, but they are still fragmented in many ways. You take services, for instance, it's still extremely difficult to trade services across countries, even though it's one market. So I think the story is really kind of observing that. So just in terms of these kinds of numbers, you see the U.S. kind of streaking ahead and Europe looking at the U.S. thinking, we need to catch up. We need to be doing something. Not only, you mentioned militarily, we need to do something in terms of innovation, in terms of tech. We need to do things in terms of the one market. So that's kind of what this stock take is about. And I think it's really interesting because it doesn't feel that way.
Yeah, for me, if I take a step back and I look at things, speaking very broadly, the U.S. is focused very much so on efficiency, on productivity, on getting the most economic, squeezing the most growth you can, whether that's in labor is basically just an input. Whereas in Europe, there seems to be a bit more of a balance. And if we're looking at things anecdotally, at least I am in this case looking at it, I don't know any Americans, for example, who I've met in the last couple of years who tell me they would move back to the US having lived in Europe for whatever, X number of years. And this is not just sort of international civil servants, but people working in the private sector and elsewhere who tell me the same thing. And I don't think that's by accident. So my sense is that if we're measuring sort of economic growth or what constitutes doing well as a country in only a certain way, then yes, the U.S. is doing great. We also, that's one thing. The second thing is we're looking at things on a very sort of a top line level. So yeah, the California is doing great as economy, New York, whoever. But then when you dig a bit deeper in the numbers, the concentration, not just of wealth, but of economic growth is, for example, in the stock market, it's basically driven by a handful of companies, 5 or 6 companies. And you wouldn't know that by reading the headlines. You would just know, wow, the Dow Jones hit 40,000 or whatever it is. The stock market's going crazy. It's going bonkers. But it's really a handful of companies. The expansion is really concentrated in a select few. Whereas in Europe, it doesn't feel the case, but it still seems to be struggling to get a foothold. They seem to have figured out sort of the work-life balance, if you want to call it that, the actual aspect of living your life, not just working. Whereas in the U.S., it's the complete opposite. And what you don't factor into these sort of calculations about economic growth is the fact that it's kind of baked in that, yeah, you're going to commute an hour and a half, 2 hours to work each way, which is kind of unheard of in Europe. But on the other hand, you're not getting that economic growth. So I don't know what the answer is. I know, personally speaking, what makes more sense to me as a human being in terms of what I want to get out of life. Human with a Y. But that's just my 2 cents. I know it's kind of rambling, but I feel like we still haven't figured out a good way of, we need a purchasing price parity model for work-life balance.
No, I think we need exactly a quality of life parity thing.
Yeah.
Because these aggregate numbers mask a lot of things about quality of life. They mask things like health outcomes. They mask education outcomes. They mask satisfaction with life. They mask how likely you are to wear flip-flops on an airplane.
Yeah.
I mean, are you going to be doing that in Europe? I don't think so.
You know
They
why
mask
also?
the existence of things like Spirit Airlines.
I have like an uncle who's like quasi-survivalist. He told me once, don't wear flip-flops on an airplane. Not because they look bad, because if you need to run from a terrorist attack, it's better not to do it in flip-flops. True story.
It would also be silly to run away from a terrorist in flip-flops. You'd be like...
Exactly. You don't want to look bad, right?
Yeah, no.
While you're doing it.
Not in front of the terrorist.
Do it in leather moccasins. Moving on. We're opening a new chapter in this podcast, and that is we're going to join the rest of the other podcasts in the world and talk about AI
Yes, exactly.
in hyperbolic terms.
Yeah.
And that clapping you hear is us clapping for ourselves.
For our own selves.
So the IMF has recently warned that it could tank, and that is AI, the global economy, not this podcast, while others are saying the hype is dying. And I don't know if we're talking about the podcast or AI now. So IMF First Deputy Managing Director Geeta Gopinath warned that AI's true disruptive potential might surface during economic downturns, potentially turning a regular recession into a severe crisis. Speaking at an AI summit here in Geneva, she noted that while we often worry about AI's impact on privacy and misinformation, a bigger risk lies in AI amplifying economic problems by disrupting labor markets, financial markets, and supply chains. So I'm already worried.
Doesn't sound great.
No.
Frankly.
During downturns, companies might replace workers with automation, leading to significant job losses, especially in advanced economies. To mitigate these risks, Gopinath suggested balanced tax policies, shocker, improved worker education and social safety nets, and using AI for solutions like upskilling and early financial warnings. It seems like we know the solutions. We say them often in broad terms, but nobody does anything about it.
Yeah, and it's weird that they're kind of weighing in now, but this is like typical IMF, like bringing 90s solutions to 2024. So they're saying if there's a supply chain crisis, AI-driven supply chain solutions might come up with nonsense and send all the ships in the wrong direction. Or if there's a financial market depression, AI might make it worse by everybody rushing in the same direction. If you're firing a few people, you might fire a lot of people because AI. It seems like a kind of superficial way of looking at things. And I feel like it's coming at a time when and we have some other stories which are talking about a kind of backlash against AI hyperbole. So we have people saying it's got fewer applications than they thought. It doesn't solve as many problems as they had hoped. It has super high costs in terms of development, billions and zillions and so on. And that it's kind of becoming a little bit commoditized.
I think that it's definitely a bubble. And you know it's a bubble when Fox News starts selling commercials to old people about AI reverse mortgages. To sum it up, I think both those things can be true. I think it's definitely a bubble. I think there's probably overinvestment. It's definitely over-indexed as a industry, if you can call it that. At the same time, it's good to see that people are recognizing, or people in positions of power or with influence are recognizing that there's an issue here and that it can be solved with the good old things of upskilling, balanced tax policies, and improved worker education. We've heard about these things over and over again. These were supposed to help solve imbalances caused by trade, which does produce winners and losers. We know that now. We know what the solutions are. Now, the issue is how do we put those in place? Because AI, I think, does provide an overall benefit, like trade. I think it feels like we're talking about trade now. We're just replacing AI with trade. But we need all those things.
And China. And China.
Just wait till China uses AI to its advantage. We need to ban Chinese AI. Peter S. Goodman is the global economics correspondent for the New York Times, my old job. He's based in New York, where he has reported on some of the most significant economic events of the past few decades, and appears regularly on the New York Times Daily podcast, as well as on major broadcast outlets like CBS News, CNN, the BBC, MSNBC, and right here on Tradesplaining. He was previously executive global news and business editor of the Huffington Post, where he oversaw award-winning investigative international business and tech reporting.
He's also a prolific author. We know because we actually interviewed him with notable works including Davos Man, How the Billionaires Devoured the World. We interviewed him on that one. And Past Due, The End of Easy Money and the Renewal of the American Economy, we hope. He joins us again to talk about his latest book, How the World Ran Out of Everything, which explores the intricacies of the global supply chain, and that you can find wherever you get your books.
Like this podcast.
Except Google Books, which went out of business.
Which will be close.
But now you can find it on YouBooks.
So, Peter, thanks for joining us once again on the podcast. It's really a pleasure to have you on once again.
Thanks for having me.
It's been about a year and a half since we last spoke, and I think you've been pretty busy since then. You wrote in a book. I can tell what it's about just from the title. It's called How the World Ran Out of Everything. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, you bet. So it's the story of the supply chain and how it essentially buckled in the face of the pandemic and revealed problems that have really been there for decades. I think we all remember running out of toilet paper. We remember running out of things that are much more significant, like ventilators in the middle of a public health catastrophe. We ran out of computer chips, which affected all sorts of industries. People who were getting their kitchens renovated couldn't find the plywood. They couldn't find the color that they settled on with the contractor. And what happened was really much bigger than the pandemic. What I came to understand as I started to do some stories on these shortages, there were the most obvious causes. We had something like $250 billion at any one time of goods just floating on container ships that were stuck off of ports around the world because they were so overwhelming the workings of the global supply chain that they couldn't pull up and dock. I discovered there was monopoly power that went into explaining how lots of companies were keeping their products scarce as a way to raise prices. And once there was a shock to the system, we actually ran out of stuff. Diving into this fascinating story of the characters behind the supply chain, I hope if people read it, they'll never see a package from Amazon or UPS or DHL the same again, because I came to understand that this basic delivery system for goods depends upon the labors of just millions and millions of people who normally we don't give a thought to, who are just behind the scenes. And a lot of these people are working in jobs that have been so downgraded over the decades by a combination of dilution of union power, deregulation, that in the middle of a pandemic, we supposedly ran out of workers. Essentially, we just ran out of people who are willing to go through the misery that is involved in working in a warehouse or driving a long-haul truck or maintaining a railroad. So this story is really a story of how we built this rickety, financially optimized supply chain, built really for the interests of investors, not for the rest of us, and how it buckled in the middle of the pandemic.
We talk to a lot of sort of economists. A lot of them will tell you efficiency has been sort of the name of the game, and efficiency is good. We want things to get there as efficiently, as quickly as possible at the lowest cost. Coming from your side, you're seeing it a bit differently, if I understood correctly. Are you saying that efficiency, or we shouldn't be thinking about it that way, or at least taking in the considerations of things like labor and how that's affecting labor negatively in this case?
I mean, of course, we should think about efficiency. Who's against efficiency? By definition, it's something that's good. The problem is that the way that we've defined efficiency just ignores all sorts of things that are incredibly inefficient. I'll give you an example. So a lot of the reason why we ran out of stuff in the worst of the pandemic, and why there's still important things that are missing in the supply chain, is because for decades, much of the manufacturing world has been governed by this concept of just in time or lean. These were concepts pioneered in Japan when Toyota, at the end of the Second World War, came up with the intelligent idea that instead of just making as many cars as possible and hoping to just shove them through the distribution channels and let salesmen figure out how to sell them, let's just make cars to replace the ones that we've already sold. And let's take that so granular that this part of a part, we're only going to make enough to replace the ones that someone has immediately removed from the workstations. And we're going to work with our suppliers so the stuff's showing up at our factories, instead of overwhelming us with product that we have to stick in a warehouse somewhere, will just be very precise and efficient in terms of ordering of this stuff. Well, this was a very sensible idea. It worked really well for Toyota. And along came financialization, by which I mean running large publicly traded companies purely for the benefit of investors. Let's try to make share prices go up in the immediate term as, again, efficiently as possible. And that involved doing some things that turned out to be very inefficient. So I tell the story of how McKinsey played a key role in persuading the CEOs of publicly traded companies, instead of filling warehouses full of stuff that you don't need right now, why don't you just liquidate your inventory, take the extra money, give it to yourselves as a reward for being geniuses who hired McKinsey. Let's give it to shareholders in the form of dividends and share buybacks. That will make share prices go up. Wall Street will just love it. And as long as nothing bad happens, the consumer won't really care. And when something bad does happen, well, that'll be somebody else's problem, because it'll be so many quarters down the road that we won't worry about it. So that took us to the place where I talked to, these stories are sort of everywhere, but I ran into a guy in Minnesota, a guy named Jerome Bodner. I tell the story of how this guy's working at an industrial engine factory in Minnesota. And one day, the smart kids, fresh from Ivy League universities, show up from McKinsey's office in Chicago. And they tell this guy who'd been in business for 20 years with a business degree from the University of Minnesota, "You're doing it all wrong. You need to diminish your inventory. You need to go just in time." And he says, "Well, what do you mean? We make these giant engines that have to be installed by cranes at places like hospitals. Like, we can't be late. If we're late, it messes everything up." "Oh, no, you're doing it wrong. You could save a lot of money first by limiting the huge parts that you're bringing in from places like Japan." And eventually they persuade this factory to limit the number of $5 sheet metal brackets. This is going to improve the metrics that investors want to see. Their inventory will be lower, and so they'll have better return on assets on their balance sheet. And because of this, they start losing the capability to make engines on time, and they have to air freight giant parts at much higher cost. They miss orders. They actually have to pay penalties in their contracts when they're late installing this stuff. So for the sake of saving $5 on a sheet metal bracket that they're not keeping in a warehouse, they end up losing millions of dollars in orders. But again, in later quarters, in the next quarter, everything looks great. So here's an example of a very perverse kind of efficiency that's governing this company. And by the way, like when this guy complains, he gets reported to his bosses as not being sufficiently with the program. And within McKinsey, they talk about people who are most dedicated to the cause of lean manufacturing or just in time as the lean Taliban. And this guy suffers the wrath of the lean Taliban. But it's one of many examples where we measure efficiency in this very short-term way. And the result is we run out of ventilators in the middle of a pandemic. And as a business school professor I quote in the book put it to me, it's like, yeah, okay, it's great when you're limiting your production and your share price is going up. Well, when you need a ventilator and you can't make one, you can't say publicly, well, at least our share price is high. That's not efficient.
We talk a lot about these things, let's say supply chain gluts. We make a lot of jokes on this podcast. Rob is still waiting for his bike, for example. It's somewhere in the Panama Canal. But these things have oftentimes sort of real world implications, often at the local level, in local communities and economies. And this is something we also forget about when we're making these jokes or talking in sort of these macro terms. I guess that's one benefit of trying to find a narrative. And for example, in the work you do in the books you've done and in your articles as well. Can you talk about that a little bit? What are some things that stood out to you in terms of the impact that this has on people's lives? You mentioned the truck worker just now, but are there anything else?
I'll give you the example that I think about frequently. I talked to the daughter of a slaughterhouse worker in Denver. This woman was a refugee from Myanmar. She fled Myanmar. She's ethnically Karen into a refugee camp in Thailand where she delivered birth to her daughter. They lived there for 15 years. They got asylum in the U.S. They picked the U.S. because they were told this is a place where an immigrant can make a living if they're willing to work hard. She gets a job at a slaughterhouse an hour outside of Denver, Greeley, Colorado, owned by JBS, which is the world's largest meat packer. It's a Brazilian company run by two convicted felons, these brothers who served prison time in Brazil for borrowing all this money through illegal means, using the money to buy up slaughterhouse capacity around the world, including in the United States. So this woman, Tin Ai, when the pandemic begins, her daughter is begging her, please don't go to work. We can see that there are COVID cases popping up in your building. This is long before there are vaccines. No one really understands how this thing spreads, but one can imagine that working in close quarters with people who are sweating and hacking animals that weigh thousands of pounds and water jets shooting all over the place, this is probably a pretty good way to spread this coronavirus. And Tin Ai says, listen, I don't have paid sick leave. If I don't work, I don't get paid. I can't pay the bills without this job. She continues to go off to work, and she becomes one of the 5 people who dies in the first wave of the pandemic at that plant. As San Twin, her daughter, is telling me this story, she's holding her then 8 or 9 month old baby on her lap, who's looking up at a photo of this grandmother that he's never going to meet. And this, of course, was just chilling. But the part that I didn't understand, coming back to your point about efficiency, I didn't understand until I dug into the book, is that the reason why these slaughterhouses were open, in large part because the meat packers, companies like JBS, through their lobby in Washington, persuaded the Trump administration that if we didn't keep these slaughterhouses going, regardless of the risks, and public health authorities at the local level were saying we need to shut these plants down, they're super spreaders. And the Trump administration bought this argument from the meat packers industry that if you shut these plants, we're not going to be able to feed Americans. And so the Trump administration delivered this executive order that overrode local public health restrictions. And they did so praising workers for being essential workers. Well, meanwhile, it later leaked out through emails. The people at the lobby shop, the trade association in Washington, were openly joking, not openly, like amongst themselves. They were joking about this idea of there being a meat shortage because American meat packers were sitting on record volumes of meat and were, in fact, exporting record volumes of meat to places like China. So at the moment that they're saying, Tin Eye has to continue showing up to work at this plant and risking her life, or Americans are going to go hungry. They're actually exporting more meat than they ever have. So this is an example of how this concept of efficiency, these huge operations of scale, which are really engineered to boost profit margins for a handful of companies that get to set the rules, are coming at, in this case, the worst kind of social cost. We basically killed slaughterhouse workers in the name of feeding Americans while actually feeding the profit margins of a handful of giant monopolistic companies.
That's a really poignant example. One thing that strikes me hearing you talk about is that COVID, the pandemic, quote unquote, is almost 4, maybe 5 years. It's going to be coming on 5 years in the past. And that, I guess, with time, it makes people forget. I think at the time, it highlighted a lot of the things that you're talking about. If somebody had to ask you, how do you think this sort of plays out? What would be your take? Because my sense is that with time, we'll tend to forget. For example, when things start becoming late night TV host jokes, then that's really the point where you start to really forget about how acute the situation was. And in this case, people dying is something I, for example, forgot about quite easily. If we're talking about March, April of 2020, if I'm thinking back at it now, it was quite a sort of a scary moment, especially in New York, for example, which is quite hard hit, my family there and things like this. How do you think this plays out would be first question. And two, having said all that, what would need to be done in your opinion? So what is the solution?
Well, these are really important questions. I do think, to go back to this example of McKinsey's role in just in time, I do think it's important to heed something that a McKinsey consultant, whose story I tell in the book, who was sort of seminal in propagating this idea of lean manufacturing and encouraging industries to not just be lean with their inventory, but to make workers more flexible, make workers become contractors and part-timers so that you can feed them into the industrial apparatus as you need them, never mind the needs of their families, the needs of reliable paychecks. What serves the interest of the company? Well, by the middle of the pandemic, I said, seems like people like you kind of have a lot to explain right now. And he said, yeah, look, we definitely overdid it with just in time. This guy named Knut Alecki, who works in the German headquarters of McKinsey, he said, yeah, we definitely went too far. And I said, well, do you think there'll be any change? And he said, yes, companies now, they're talking about not just in time, they're talking about just in case. So they're putting more inventory into warehouses. We know, of course, that major retailers like Walmart, Amazon, Target, Home Depot, multinational companies like IKEA, they're increasingly looking to diversify away from a traditional, almost sole reliance on factories in China. And they're looking to spread production around other parts of the globe so that the shipping crisis that we lived through, we saw the price of moving a container of goods from Asia to the West Coast of the US go up tenfold in a matter of months during the pandemic. For all of these reasons, it's time to think about more redundancy, which is less efficient. So I asked this guy, Knut Alecki, I said, well, do you think this will really stick? And he said, well, companies have a way of forgetting pretty quickly. And I tend to think that he's right, because if you go back, the first supply chain crisis story I ever wrote was in 1999. There was a big earthquake in Taiwan. It knocked some of the computer chip manufacturers offline, and there were shortages. And some people said then, we've overdone it with just in time. We've concentrated too much production on this one island. We need to spread it around. Never happened. 2012, the Fukushima nuclear disaster in Japan, lots of shortages of lots of stuff for years afterwards, lots of talk of the need to build more resilience into the supply chain. Again, basically nothing happened. Now, this shock was much greater. It hit consumers in a very serious way. Companies lost sales. So there are real things that are happening, and it's happening at the same time that, of course, the US and China, their relationship is so different. So this linchpin of the global supply chain, China, is now viewed in Washington as an enemy to be contained, which is encouraging companies to think seriously about more resilience and, again, about diversifying their reliance on suppliers just in China. But there's the basic financial incentive has not changed, which is to say, if you are in charge of keeping the shelves stocked at Target or Walmart, and you are working for a board that would like costs to be as low as possible so that profit margins can be as great as possible. So there's cash to pay executives. So there's cash to distribute to shareholders. And your solution to this problem is to go somewhere where it might be more expensive to make goods, or there's going to be a significant short-term cost in moving production to some new place, or you're going to fill warehouses that are now empty with more parts. That's going to use up capital. Well, you may be doing something that's very prudent. 10 years from now, when there's another shock, people may say, oh, that guy had it right. Thank goodness we listened to him. But there's a good chance that that guy's already unemployed because the CFO or CEO who says, no, we're going to keep costs really low right now so that in the next quarter, our margin is fat. That guy's going to get rewarded and is going to stay in the corner office for a long time and cash stock options that are worth more as a result. So this basic incentive that rewards short-term cutting of costs and penalizes things that might be smart and actually more efficient in the long run, that's still there, which suggests to me that there's still some basic forces that will maintain the status quo, which will make us more vulnerable to more supply chain shocks.
One thing I forgot to ask you is if we're taking a step back and looking at things in terms of geopolitical tensions, you mentioned China and the U.S. Obviously, now we've got Mexico. There's a big tug of war in terms of sort of nearshoring, if you want to call it that, production there. But we've also seen in recent months what's going on in the Suez Canal, and with Houthi rebels in Yemen as well, with what's going on in Gaza. How does this sort of play into your thinking or in writing the book? I imagine this happened after you finished writing the book, but has this factored in at all into your thinking? And if so, how?
No, I snuck that stuff in it. That stuff's in the book. Panama Canal and passing, the Houthis firing at ships, entering the Suez Canal. That's all in there. And certainly we all remember, I think, the Ever Given, this giant container ship that got lodged in the Suez Canal back in 2020 and shut down the canal for nearly a week.
That gave us like 2 months worth of material to talk about on the podcast. So I can't be too angry. There was literally jokes.
Oh, at least. Yeah, no, the memes are still out there. Yeah, have at it. Look, this stuff has definitely changed the conversation at the corporate level around what's prudent in terms of supply chains. Nobody designed this supply chain, right? We didn't have a bunch of wizards go up to the top of a mountain and meditate on the best way to design a supply chain. We've got all these overlapping supply chains. We've got all these overlapping industries that are totally uncoordinated, that have been in the States deregulated, that at the global level where it really matters, there have never been regulations, right? No one is watching the shipping cartel. It seems like there's scores of ocean carriers. There's really basically three giant alliances, like airline alliances, that dominate ocean transport, ocean cargo. And these companies made out like bandits during what everybody describes as this crisis, as if it was a crisis for these ocean carriers, that they were stuck with 50, 70 ships literally floating in a queue off the ports of LA Long Beach. I tell the story of this one container that I follow from a factory in China to a warehouse in Mississippi, and I x-ray the floating traffic jam, the mother of all traffic jams off of LA Long Beach in the fall of 2021. And we discussed this as if, oh, what a terrible accident. These companies must really want to change this. Well, the ocean carriers themselves, there's three alliances that control 98% of the traffic coming from Asia across the Pacific to the West Coast of the United States. They were able to raise their prices from roughly $2,000 to move a container across the Pacific to $25,000, $27,000, $30,000 for that same box. And they registered record profits. As an industry, they made $300 billion moving cargo in the course of 2022. So if there's one thing that one should take away from my book, and that I think most people in the business press are afraid to discuss because it's impolite, but it's reality, is that our entire global economy is now dependent on this industry that is unregulated and that is a cartel. And that is a serious problem that is simply not going to be addressed in piecemeal fashion. So this has now gotten attention of corporate boardrooms. And certainly at the margins, the most forward-looking companies are thinking about ways to limit their vulnerability to that cartel. They're looking at a geopolitical landscape that's full of risks that are very difficult to predict, very difficult to calibrate. And they're saying, gee, it might be a better idea to have more of our production close to the places we're actually selling stuff to consumers. So John Deere, giant construction and farm equipment manufacturer. They have a big factory in Victoria, Texas, about 3 hours south of Houston. And they have basically said to all their suppliers in Asia, these are companies that are making components for this construction gear. If you want our business, you better figure out how to set up within a 5-hour drive of that plant in Victoria, Texas, or we're going to find somebody else to replace you. And as a result of that, I spent a lot of time for the tail end of this book in places like Mexico, Guatemala. There are companies from around the globe that are now looking to set up factories there because they understand that the U.S. is still the world's largest consumer market. They don't want to lose it. This includes Chinese companies, by the way. I did a big chapter on this industrial park that's popped up in Nuevo Leon, which is a border state. Monterrey is the capital. And this is an industrial park that's full of 28 giant Chinese companies that have traditionally exported from China to the United States. They're now setting up in Mexico as a way to get closer to the market. And this is a whole bunch of different things, right? It's the stuff we already talked about in terms of the shipping cartel. It's the Trump, now Biden tariffs, and the assumption that this relationship between the U.S. and China is going to be mostly about animosity. And so with these new risks, there are rational reasons for companies to move their production closer to their markets. But for reasons we've already discussed, we should also be clear that low costs have not gone away as something with great currency in determining what happens to the global economy.
Excellent. Well, I'm going to go home and cry in my pillow tonight. So thank you for that, painting that beautiful picture.
Well, don't cry in your pillow. Go start paying attention to place. Like, we've all grown up in a time where place somehow doesn't matter, right? I mean, my book tells the story of how Henry Ford gives us mass assembly. A guy named Malcolm McLean standardizes container shipping, which makes shipping much cheaper, much easier. Then China enters the WTO in 2001. You put these three things together, and every CEO on earth now has an easy way to lower costs. Go move your production to China, get the lowest cost. Doesn't matter where you are, as long as a ship shows up somewhere near you, or it doesn't even need to be near you, as long as it shows up where you can transfer your cargo to rail or a truck. Like, you can get anything everywhere. It's all a network, right? We're all on the internet. Our transportation is all linked up. These prices are basically free. That was the most striking thing I heard, I think, in the course of doing the book. I had this interview with the CEO of Columbia Sportswear who said, yeah, we essentially built our business. This is a business based just outside Portland, Oregon, with the assumption that container shipping, trucking, rail, it's like flipping a light switch. The lights always go on. Don't give it another thought. Well, now we're giving it another thought. And so place is back. We need to start grappling with, where exactly is this coming from? Who is responsible for bringing it to me? And how could that fail? What conditions are people laboring in? And how excited are they going to be to continue to work if they have better options? And so we don't need to cry into our pillows. We need to think seriously about how we ought to design a supply chain that is working not just for investors, but for all of us, for patients who need medicine, for society in the middle of a pandemic or whatever shock comes our way, for people who want amusements like gadgets, for people who want to be able to put an exercise machine in their basement or buy clothing or school supplies or whatever.
Or order your book.
Or order my book, right. Actually, there were some supply chain problems to grapple with in getting my book. Yeah, order it early, people. Who knows how it's getting?
Excellent. Peter, thanks so much for this. You've really helped highlight and put a spotlight on issues that sometimes even myself, I tend to gloss over. in the day-to-day of my work. Before we go, where can people go to find your book, find out more about what you're doing, and find the articles?
That's kind of you to ask. I got a website, petersgoodman.com. I'm easy to find on LinkedIn, on Twitter. Sorry, I can't say X. All the usual social, or you type in my byline, Peter S. Goodman, New York Times. You'll see my stuff. And the book is called How the World Ran Out of Everything Inside the Global Supply Chain.
Excellent. Peter, it's been a pleasure having you on. Till next time, or the next book.
All right. I really appreciate it. This was great.
That brings us to our next segment. This is the vibe shift with TS correspondent Michelle. Michelle, have we finally encountered the end of globalization?
Well, I'm not sure. I'm not going to talk about globalization. I'm going to talk about the metaverse.
Okay.
So I know the metaverse is kind of old, but remember when that was a thing? Remember when we weren't
really
talking about AI and we
really
were
big
talking
verse.
about the metaverse?
Yeah.
It was like the past buzzword cycle.
Bitcoin.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Remember Bitcoin?
Crypto to
There's
the
a whole
moon.
thing. And then we're going to have quantum computers and we're going to forget about AI. Anyway, we made like 10 episodes about this and then we never talked about it again. But I haven't forgotten, and IKEA hasn't forgotten either, because they're getting ready to open a store on one of the metaverses, which is Roblox.
Okay.
Have you guys heard about Roblox? No?
I've heard of it. I don't know exactly what
It's like
for
where
kids,
all the
no?
Gen Alpha kids hang
It's for
out.
kids, no?
Yes,
Yeah.
but it is technically the only metaverse that survived the whole metaverse
Is
craze
it?
thing.
It's the one.
Yeah, because people pay money to be there, and it's kids, sure, but like at least there's people there. Because if you've been to any of the other metaverses lately, it's kind of empty. Anyway, IKEA bought a space on Roblox, and they're now offering jobs in their virtual store. So the job is fully remote, obviously.
No.
It pays 13 euros an hour. And basically, you're just supposed to sell IKEA furniture, well, virtual IKEA furniture, to other Roblox users. Unfortunately, the applications closed last Sunday, and only 10 people will be chosen worldwide. But if you want to work for free, apparently IKEA is happy to have you work for free if you want. You don't have to apply if you want to work for free. So it seems that even in the metaverse, unpaid internships are a thing.
Thanks, IKEA. The UN thanks you.
Yep.
We're not the only ones.
IKEA keeping it up in the metaverse.
I would apply for that job, and just because we need to tie it in with AI, I would get AI to code me like a fake me to just be there all day. So I'll be collecting money for free while living my best life.
Fake
in the
money.
real world.
But also I'm asking, do you have
Fake
to
money.
assemble your IKEA furniture in the metaverse?
Oh, that's a good question.
Do we?
You know who that question is for?
What?
The new people working for IKEA in the metaverse.
Yeah.
Imagine you've got like the VR headset, you're trying to screw in a thing and you knock over your coffee cup.
We're going to follow this up with, obviously, this is going to be a big part of our reporting going
Absolutely.
forward. Thank you for bringing that to our attention.
Thank you for listening.
Globalization's not dead. We don't know.
It's on life support.
We're not
So,
sure.
so yeah, globalization still a thing in the metaverse.
Okay. Fantastic. Real good. So that brings us to This Week in Local News segment. You wouldn't believe this was true unless you lived in Geneva or probably really anywhere else. In our first story, it's more of a public service announcement. Maersk has come out to say right now it's already time to start ordering your Christmas gifts. There may be supply chain gluts. There's the Houthis. There's various types of people that are trying to stop your Apple phone.
The hoodies and the blowfish?
Hoodies and the blowfish are trying to stop your iPhone from getting here. So, it may not feel Christmassy right now. Maybe it's a little warm. Maybe there's a little climate change that you're experiencing. Get your orders in now. What would you like for Christmas, Artie?
I would like a copy of Hootie and the Blowfish. I only want to be with you.
Hooties.
The vinyl.
Blowfish. Michelle, what would you like to order 8 months in advance for your Christmas
I would like
situation?
the paid version of Artie to get updated.
If you'd like to get Artie version 4,
I
you'll
want
need
OSRD 2.0.
You'll
Fan
need
of-
somebody to recommend you.
I'm not even a fan of Hootie and the Blowfish because they're,
You know why you're a fan? Because it's pre-2016.
yeah.
Well, folks, that about wraps up episode 65, brought to you by the Repositioning Global Production. Thanks, IKEA. The U.S. winning for once. AI hype now by the IMF. We also want to thank Peter S. Goodman of the New York Times for his insights on the global supply chain, as he calls it, and, of course, staying chill in this era of rapid change.
That's right. We also want to thank our executive producer, Michelle Olguin, as well as Armina Sinani for helping and highlight the vibe shift, as well as in producing this and every TS episode. Please also don't forget to subscribe to the podcast if you haven't done so already. Make sure you catch our next episode coming out very, very soon. You can find us anywhere you get your podcasts. So Apple Podcasts, Spotify, not Google Podcasts, but anywhere else. You can also find us, as I mentioned, on YouTube. So please check us out there. Subscribe, give us a like, a follow, do all that good fun stuff. Don't forget to leave us a review either on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube. Leave us a comment. We do read all of them, so please be gentle. You can follow us on Twitter at Tradesplaining, or you can follow us on the artist formerly known as Twitter at Tradesplaining, or on Instagram at trade.splaining, or email us your questions, comments to us the old-fashioned way at trade.splaining@gmail.com. Once again, that's trade.splaining@gmail.com.
And remember, folks,
Listen responsibly.